Welcome back to the deep dive, where we take a look at all of those sources that you've been meaning to get to, but just haven't had the time.
And really try to extract the most important points.
Yeah, absolutely. So today we're diving into something pretty complex. We're going to be looking at some Ukrainian perspectives on the country's journey since independence, and we've got a pretty long conversation to go through.
Yeah, we do.
But it's a fascinating one. It's between Ukrainian political commentator Alexei Arestovich and Russian journalist Yulia Latynina.
And just to set the stage, this conversation was recorded in January of 2025, so that's important to keep in mind as we go through this.
Yeah, absolutely. It provides a lot of context.
Yeah.
Right off the bat, Arestovich makes a pretty striking analogy.
Yeah, he does.
He says that both Ukraine and Russia have been acting like Indians tricked into fighting each other.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, for the benefit of powerful Western nations.
Yeah.
So right away, he's kind of setting this theme of manipulation that both sides have been played in some way.
It's interesting that he uses that analogy because it really highlights the power imbalance and the sense of being exploited.
And he even goes on to say that both Putin and Zelensky kind of point the finger at NATO for the situation that they're both in, right? Despite the immense suffering.
Right. So they're both kind of acknowledging that there's this external force at play.
Exactly.
But they're also still at odds with each other.
Yeah, it's a complicated dynamic. Now, Latynina adds to this by bringing in some historical parallels. She compares the situation to the period right before the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. And she argues that both Ukraine and Russia basically reversed one revolution, the Bolshevik one.
Yeah.
But they're still stuck with the consequences of an earlier one, the February Revolution.
So there's this kind of layering of historical baggage that they're both dealing with.
Yeah, and she doesn't really go into detail about what those consequences are, but it definitely adds a layer of complexity
It definitely does.
to this whole situation. Then Arestovich shifts gears a little bit, and he starts talking about the collapse of the Soviet Union, and he sees this as a tragedy.
Interesting.
Yeah, and he contrasts it with the rise of China. China's stayed as one big unified entity.
Right.
And they've, economically and geopolitically, they're doing quite well, whereas the former Soviet republics are struggling. And he specifically points to the population decline in Ukraine.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and he actually says that it's been more devastating than any war. So that's a pretty powerful statement.
That is pretty powerful. So he's saying that even without the conflict, the population decline itself has been incredibly damaging.
Exactly. And this leads him to criticize what he sees as this lack of a clear vision for Ukraine. He says that the country has basically defined itself in opposition to Russia.
It's all about what they're not rather than what they are.
Yeah, what he calls anti-Russia. And he sees this as a very dangerous and unsustainable path. So, he suggests some alternatives. He talks about focusing on economic and cultural exchange between Europe and Russia.
Okay, so trying to position Ukraine as more of a bridge
Exactly.
rather than a buffer.
And this is where his argument about manipulation by the West really starts to come in.
Okay, let's hear.
So he claims that the West has basically been dangling this promise of NATO membership in front of Ukraine.
Oh, to kind of entice them?
Yeah, and he sees this as a way to provoke Russia and ultimately to further the West's own geopolitical goals.
So he's saying that Ukraine is being used as a pawn in a larger game.
Exactly. And he's particularly critical of Ukrainian politicians. He says they were kind of blinded by this NATO narrative. And they didn't really see the potential consequences of their actions.
So they were too focused on this idea of joining NATO without really considering the risks.
Yeah, and he actually points to a very specific example to illustrate this point.
Oh, really? What is it?
He talks about an incident where Zelensky was visiting Biden in the months leading up to the war, and he was pleading with Biden to admit Ukraine into NATO. And according to Arestovich, Biden just flatly refused.
Wow.
Yeah, he said NATO membership for Ukraine was just not on the table.
So Zelensky was basically told no straight to his face.
And what Arestovich finds really striking is that right after this rejection, Zelensky completely changed his stance on NATO. He started downplaying its importance and even criticizing the organization.
So it's like he did a complete 180.
Yeah. And this about face, as Arestovich puts it, really raises some questions about Zelensky's sincerity, about his public pronouncements about NATO. And it suggests that maybe he knew all along that the West wasn't really serious about granting membership.
So he was playing a role, basically.
Yeah. And Arestovich uses this anecdote as evidence of the West's manipulation and Zelensky's complicity in perpetuating a narrative that ultimately harmed Ukraine.
It's a pretty damning accusation.
Yeah, it is. And he goes on to point to the pronouncements of Western leaders, particularly around the Vilnius summit in 2023.
Okay.
And he argues that these statements, while appearing supportive of Ukraine's NATO aspirations, were very carefully crafted to avoid any concrete commitments.
So it was all smoke and mirrors, basically.
Exactly. A lot of talk, but no real action.
Right.
And he cites a specific example, a phone call between a high-ranking U.S. official and the head of the office of the president of Ukraine. And during this call, the U.S. official apparently lost his temper.
Oh, wow.
When he was confronted about, these demands for a clear invitation for Ukraine to join NATO. So it's like the facade of unity kind of crumbled in that moment.
It sounds like it.
And Arestovich argues that this incident shows how the West deliberately created this environment where Ukrainian leaders felt pressured to keep up this facade of progress towards NATO membership, even when it was becoming clear that it wasn't going to happen.
So they were trapped in this narrative that they couldn't escape from.
Yeah, and this allowed the West to keep using NATO as this leverage to influence Ukraine's actions.
And to avoid taking any real responsibility for the consequences.
Exactly. Now, Zelensky's infamous tweet from the plane ride to Vilnius.
Oh, yeah, I remember that one.
Where he criticized the lack of a clear timeline for Ukraine's NATO accession. Arestovich argues that this outburst was a direct result of, the frustrations and the disillusionment felt by the Ukrainian leadership. They were starting to realize the extent of the West's deception.
So it was like the dam finally broke.
Yeah. And according to Arestovich, this tweet did not go over well with the Biden administration.
I can imagine.
They were furious that Zelensky had dared to break this carefully constructed narrative of unity. And this reaction just further reinforces Arestovich's view that the West is cynically manipulating Ukraine. They're prioritizing their own interests above the aspirations of the Ukrainian people.
And that Zelensky is caught in the middle of this.
Yeah, he's walking this tightrope.
Yeah.
Now, Arestovich specifically calls out Great Britain for its role in this manipulation.
Interesting.
He accuses British officials of encouraging Ukraine to fight on without providing sufficient material support. And he sees this as a strategy that benefits Great Britain at the expense of Ukrainian lives.
So he's saying they're egging them on without actually having their back.
Exactly. And he contrasts these statements, from British officials urging Ukraine to fight with the reality on the ground, where Ukraine is struggling to get the resources they need to actually sustain the war effort.
So there's this disconnect between the rhetoric and the reality.
Yeah, and he argues that Great Britain is essentially using Ukraine to weaken Russia without having to get directly involved in the conflict themselves.
So it's a way for them to achieve their own goals without putting their own boots on the ground.
Exactly. And this goes back to his broader view of the West, exploiting Ukraine for its own strategic interests.
That's a pretty cynical view of the situation.
It is, but he makes some compelling points. He argues that this manipulation has had a devastating impact on Ukraine, leading to, loss of life and territory.
It's hard to argue with that.
Yeah. And he goes so far as to say that Ukraine has become a pawn in a larger geopolitical game.
A pawn?
Between the West and Russia.
So he's saying that they have very little agency in this situation, that they're being pulled in different directions by these powerful forces.
And he's particularly critical of this whole narrative surrounding NATO membership.
Which he sees as a false promise.
Yeah, he says it was used to manipulate Ukraine.
And that it created these unrealistic expectations.
And a sense of betrayal when those expectations weren't met.
Right, because ultimately they weren't given what they were led to believe they would get.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he points to Zelensky's recent statement where he actually admitted that Ukraine was misled about NATO membership.
Oh, wow. So even Zelensky is acknowledging this now.
Yeah. And Arestovich sees this focus on NATO as a distraction from more pressing issues.
Okay. Such as?
Like addressing corruption and building a sustainable economy.
Right. The internal issues that really need to be addressed.
Exactly. So he's calling for a more pragmatic and independent approach to Ukraine's future.
It's interesting that he's advocating for this kind of realpolitik approach.
Yeah, he's very much a realist.
And it sounds like he's lost faith in the idea that the West is going to come to Ukraine's rescue.
Absolutely. He sees them as ultimately pursuing their own interests. And he doesn't believe that those interests align with Ukraine's in the long run.
It's interesting how he compares Ukraine to other former Soviet republics like Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan.
Yeah, he definitely sees them as having a more successful approach.
He seems to think they've been a lot smarter.
Yeah, and he really admires their strategic vision.
Yeah.
The way they've managed to maintain good relations with all these different global powers.
Right.
Russia, China, Turkey, the West.
Like they're not picking sides.
Exactly. They're playing the field, and Arestovich thinks Ukraine could learn a lot from that.
About not putting all their eggs in one basket, so to speak.
Yeah. He's also pretty critical of the education system in Ukraine. He argues that removing history and other subjects as mandatory requirements has really hurt the country.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, he thinks it's led to a lack of understanding of Ukraine's past and its place in the world.
So a kind of historical amnesia.
Yeah, and he sees that as a real problem. He thinks a deeper understanding of history could help Ukrainians make better decisions about their future.
Makes sense.
He also laments the decline of Ukraine's industrial base. All of those factories and shipyards that used to be so vibrant.
Right.
And now they're just falling apart. He contrasts that with China's rise.
Which he clearly sees as a model.
Oh, yeah. He's very impressed with China's economic success and geopolitical power. And he thinks Ukraine could be doing a lot more to revitalize its economy and attract investment.
That's a tall order given the current situation.
Absolutely. And then there's the demographic challenge.
The shrinking population.
Yeah, it's a huge problem.
Yeah.
Arestovich actually argues that the population decline has been more devastating than any war in Ukraine's history.
Wow. That's a pretty stark statement.
It is. And he's concerned about the brain drain. All the talented people leaving the country. He thinks that's going to hurt Ukraine's long-term prospects.
It's hard to rebuild a country without people.
Exactly. So he's calling for a more inclusive and equitable society, one that can attract and retain talent. He sees that as essential for Ukraine's future.
And that ties into his call for a new kind of leadership.
Oh, absolutely. He thinks Ukraine needs leaders who are willing to break with the past, challenge the status quo, and put the interests of the people first.
So not the same old corrupt politicians.
Yeah, he's had enough of that. He wants leaders who are not afraid to make tough decisions, who are committed to fighting corruption, and who have a clear vision for the future.
It sounds like he's describing himself.
He might be. He doesn't shy away from saying that he thinks he could be that kind of leader, the one to guide Ukraine towards a better future.
Just a bold claim.
It is. But you have to admire his passion and his commitment to Ukraine.
And his willingness to speak his mind.
Yeah, he's definitely not afraid to ruffle some feathers.
It's fascinating how he seems to admire their approach.
Yeah, their ability to kind of play all sides.
Exactly.
Not get too close to any one power.
He sees it as a really smart strategy.
Especially given, Ukraine's history and its position, as he puts it, a borderland.
Right. Always caught in between.
What stands out to you about Arestovich's overall assessment of Ukraine's journey?
Well, it's pretty bleak.
Yeah.
I mean, he doesn't sugarcoat things,
Right.
but it's clear that he thinks a drastic change is needed.
Like a complete overhaul.
Yeah, both in terms of leadership and in the country's overall approach.
Like he's calling for a revolution and thinking
Exactly.
to break free from the past.
A rejection of the old paradigms and a embrace of a new vision.
And he seems to think he's the one to lead that revolution.
Well, he doesn't lack confidence.
That's for sure.
But his arguments are interesting.
Yeah.
Even if they are controversial.
They definitely raise some important questions.
About the path Ukraine has taken.
And the choices it faces going forward.
He seems to be arguing that true independence requires more than just political sovereignty.
It's about a mindset.
Exactly.
A way of seeing yourself in the world.
He talks about this need to unlearn the lessons of the past 34 years.
To break free from this cycle of manipulation and dependency.
Which he sees as the defining characteristic of Ukraine's relationship with the West.
It's a powerful image.
It is.
This idea of unlearning.
Like you have to wipe the slate clean and start over.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I think the question that lingers is, can Ukraine find a new path forward?
Can they break free from the constraints of their past?
Forge a new identity.
One that empowers them to navigate the complexities of the 21st century.
Yes, the challenge.
And it's a challenge that Arestovich believes is worth fighting for.
Well, this deep dive has given us a lot to think about.
It has.
Arestovich's perspective is just one of many.
Of course.
But it's a powerful one.
And a thought-provoking one.
His arguments raise important questions about Ukraine's history, its relationship with the West, and its future direction.
Yeah.
What will Ukraine's role be on the global stage if it steps away from defining itself in opposition to Russia?
What new identity could emerge?
These are questions worth pondering.
Absolutely.
As we continue to observe the unfolding situation in Ukraine.
Thank you for joining us on The Deep Dive.
We'll see you next time.